General.
Flight Simulator is saturating those cores so much that the game is actually rather stuttery. The average nominal frame rate looks okay-ish, but the frame times are full of elongated stutters. If you compare this 4-core performance to 6, 8, or 12 cores, you can see how the game has a much lower frame rate overall and extremely unstable frame times. In comparison,
well, if there's one thing that we've learned about Flight Sim 2020 since it's launched, it's that everyone is on the quest for more FPS. Although you don't need a lot of FPS in Flight Sim. In fact, if we go back to Flight Sim X, when it first launched, anyone getting double-digit FPS numbers had to have had supercomputers. Today we're going to go through some guides or some options and some tweaks and stuff that you can do on your system that's safe and simple and should, hopefully, give you better FPS by the end of this video. And if it doesn't, get mad at Microsoft. Don't get mad at me. The all-new Enthoo Pro 2 from Fantex offers the flexibility and modularity to build your next system any way you can imagine. The extremely open interior space allows for up to 12 3.5-inch drives, multiple 480mm radiators, and dual systems, making the Enthoo Pro 2 a true workhorse for either work or play. To see the complete list of specs and to see our overview types of problems with the micro stutters or the stuttering of the terrain, the pop-ins, the slow loading, both of them are running NVMe SSDs. The game just takes forever to load. That is just the game itself, or the simulator. I'm probably call it a game a million times, although I'm one of those guys that's like, it's not a game, it's a simulator, which is why it's so hard to run. No, it's hard to run because there's some bad optimizations, and we're going to try and fix those today. So we're also not screen capturing because we don't want to affect our results by having our system also doing screen capture, although there is a capture card in there. We're just lazy. So the idea here is the FPS, not about seeing it in full resolution or whatever. I'm going to justify that every time, and you're still going to complain about it, so I just wasted all my breath. Obviously, we need to know where we're starting here. So we are using a 1440p monitor, not 1080p, not 4K. Obviously, we're right in the middle. Because we're running a 3950X, 32 gigabytes of memory, and a 2080 Ti, this is kind of like the best case scenario you could possibly have until like next month when new stuff comes out. I can tell you that it's only... This hardware is not giving you really any better of an experience than lower end hardware, and you'll see that in the optimizations and the utilization of this hardware on the screen. So we are running Ultra preset. We do not have VSync on because VSync is broke. It should really just be called half sync, because whatever you set it to, you kind of get half that number. Render scaling, all that stuff, it's all default. So let's do this. We are going to go ahead, and yes, I'm using a controller because I forgot to bring my yoke. Why did the game just crash? Literally crashed in the middle of this video. Oh. All right, so I'm in a little Cub here, flying around New York City. And a couple things we want to notice right here is, one, I'm getting about 44 FPS, which isn't bad. Remember, I am at 1440p. The scenery is already loaded because we started here, so we didn't slew to it or anything. You can see we're getting this. We are going to go ahead, and yes, I'm using a controller because I didn't slew to it or anything. You can see we're getting about 45 FPS. But take a look at the utilization. There's only a couple of cores anywhere near 100. And you can see there's an awful lot of zeros and low utilization there. And that's just because this game, for whatever reason, just is not. That's kind of a stuttery mess when we're turning, huh? Now you have to remember, the camera is gonna be smoothing this out for you and making it consistent frames, where the game is all over the place in terms of like little micro stutters and stuff. Well, let's change the weather a little bit too. So we'll do clear skies versus high level clouds versus broken clouds. There we go. I think New York looks a lot like that more often than not. So like I said, we are not, and I'm just kind of going back and forth between the Empire State Building and the Freedom Tower here to just stay in this really, dude, New York looks so good. Okay, so we're in the 40s, as you can see. Let's see if we can get that higher. But we're not going to do that with the game yet. There's a couple things we want to change in Windows and our overlay settings and stuff to try and get this looking good. So like I said, I've kind of compiled a list of things that tend to be what people recommend right here. First thing we're going to start with is game mode, and it is already on. So make sure that's on. Sometimes this is off by default, and all this basically does is it really starts to sort of allocate priority to any sort of a gaming executable that's running. You would think that Microsoft would automatically recommend or recognize that Flight Sim is running and would give it priority, but make sure that game mode is on. The other thing we're going to do is make sure that background recording is off. So that's going to be in captures, record in the background when I'm playing a game. That is off by default. Okay, so background recording is off. So that's going to be in captures, record in the background when I'm playing. The other thing we're going to do is make sure that background recording is off. So that's going to be in captures, record in the background when I'm playing a game. That is off by default. Okay, so background, and you would think it's sort of on. So make sure that's on. Sometimes we're going to start things that tend to be what people recommend right here. First thing we're going to start with is game mode. And it is already on. So make sure that's on. Sometimes this is off by default. And all this basically does is it really starts to sort of allocate priority to any sort of a gaming executable that's running. You would think that Microsoft would automatically recommend or recognize that Flight Sim is running and would give it priority, but make sure that game mode is on. The other thing we're going to do is make sure that background recording is off. So that's going to be in captures, record in the background when I'm playing a game. That is off. by default. Okay, so these, so this is kind of like an always-on DVR, where you have the greatest game ever. You can actually go back and recover that from Windows recording. You want to make sure that's off. Anything that's running in the background like that can obviously have an impact on your gaming performance. Fortunately, this is off already. I was hoping to find it on, so we might find some improvements. The other thing we're going to do right now is we are going to double check our driver version. Apparently this is the first time we've opened control panel on this machine. So we're on 451.67. Now we know for a fact that NVIDIA came out with a driver on the 17th. And I've had this computer since prior to the 17th. So I'm going to assume that this driver is slightly out of date. I'm not sure how much the driver update's really going to help. It might help with some various stutters and things, but in terms of FPS, you saw the GPU wasn't being fully utilized even at 1440p with max settings. And that's probably because there's just not enough happening with the CPU, and it's not throwing enough frames to obviously be able to utilize all of it. All right, so it's down, so we're set at 140. So we are going to do a couple of things here. Let's make sure it didn't slow us down, so we're set at 144. 3D settings. This is something I always change, and I get better performance in all of my games because I want to keep the GPU running as fast as possible at all times. So instead of setting it power management mode in the 3D settings to optimal power, I always go prefer maximum performance. Keep the GPU running as fast as possible at all times. So instead of setting it power management mode in the 3D settings to optimal power, I always go prefer max set 144. 3D settings. This is something I always change, and I get better performance in all of my games because I want to keep the GPU running as fast as possible at all times. So instead of setting it power management mode in the 3D settings to optimal power, I always go prefer maximum performance. And then when it comes to texture filtering, I always go from quality to high performance. And we've seen
texture filtering.
This actually give us a significant bump in performance in our 3D Mark scores. It's going to make your GPU probably not idle down as much. So if you're the kind of person that's like, no, I want it completely throttled down when I'm not doing anything, then you may not want to change this. But I want to see if this gives us an improvement in the game whatsoever. Because if the GPU is constantly seeing this low utilization, then what it's going to do is it's not going to clock up all the way. It's going to like go to its base clock or something like that, and then come up from idle to base and never give you the boost. This will make it want to go to boost. The other thing that we're going to do too is we're going to make sure, I don't think GeForce Experience is installed on this computer. No, it's not. If GeForce Experience was on, also make sure Shadow Play is off for the same reason I mentioned for the HDR recording or the DVR recording in Windows. So there's one other thing I want to do too. I don't know if this is going to actually work, but I'm going to try it. With the game running and the executable going, we're going to go in and set the affinity and the priority on Microsoft Flight Sim to real time. Now that's what game mode should be doing, but low utilization, then what it's going to do is it's not going to clock up all the way. It's going to like go to its base clock or something like that, and then come up from idle to base and never give you the boost. This will make it want to go to boost. The other thing that we're going to do too is we're going to make sure, I don't think GeForce Experience is installed on this computer. No, it's not. If GeForce Experience was on, also make sure Shadow Play is off for the same reason I mentioned for the HDR recording or the DVR recording in Windows. So there's one other thing I want to do too. I don't know if this is going to actually work, but I'm going to try it. With the game running and the executable going, we're going to go in and set the affinity and the priority on Microsoft Flight Sim 2 real time. Now that's what game mode should be doing, but I'm not sure if it's doing anything. So I'm gonna kind of just brute force it myself, and I'll show you guys how to do that in a sec. All right, so here we are back in New York. I would say that's already a very measurable increase considering we are at 60 FPS. So we are up a solid 10, almost 10 FPS. Now I was kind of going around in circles right here in between, like I said, the Empire State Building and the Freedom Tower. So let's see. But look how consistent it is, though. So we can call this between 5 to 10 FPS just by the driver update, probably. I'm going to real-time overclock this graphics card. So you can see it went up to the clock because we have that maximum performance. So it's not letting it fluctuate with its different, like normally at 73%, that would be down. Everything we just did was good for about a solid 8 FPS or so. And you can see so far, we haven't spent any money on anything. We haven't upgraded any hardware. It's not really an upgrade, but that's fine. Let's now take a look at some of the game settings, because this is where you're going to be able to actually make some serious improvements. Now, here are the settings that give you the biggest impact on performance. Depth of field, bloom, reflections to a degree, shadow maps, texture synthesis, and super sampling. These right here cause the biggest impact to performance. And some of the other things we're going to change here, obviously, is trees, and we're going to change object level detail and terrain detail. So we're going to texture synthesis. That's fine. Let's now take a look at some of the game settings, because this is where you're going to be able to actually make some serious improvements. Now, here are the settings that give you the biggest impact on performance. Depth of field, bloom, reflections to a degree, shadow maps, texture synthesis, and super sampling. These right here cause the biggest impact to performance. And some of the other things we're going to change here, obviously, is trees, and we're going to change object level detail and terrain detail. So we're going to start by taking just the detail levels on things, but leaving this all the same, and we're going to drop these to 100. 100 is the equivalent of high setting. So we're only dropping the two sliders on level of detail for terrain and grass. Or not grass, objects. Level of detail for terrain and grass. Or not grass, objects. So that alone got us 10 FPS. And we haven't changed any of the super sampling stuff yet. So now we are flying around downtown New York, or excuse me, Manhattan. And now in the same spot where I was getting 40s when I was doing my little loop, my little circles here, my spirals, we are getting 10 FPS more. Would you call that 10, Phil? Look at that, 65. Okay, so now we've got our 60 FPS number. And look when we move the camera around now. No stutters. It's not pausing at all. Let's now go down to what I feel is the second most important thing to change right here. Now, water waves This only really comes into play when you're down close to the ground and you actually see the white caps and stuff on the water. I think that's something that we could easily set to medium and not notice any sort of negative effect in terms of fidelity and the way it looks. But texture maps, we are going to drop this down to 768. You might actually see some jaggies in the shadows real close to the ground, but you're not going to see it when you're up in the air flying at any altitude whatsoever. I'd say even 500 feet, it would be better than than sitting on the ground. It's going to smooth it out. But we're also going to change here the 6x6 on texture super sampling. We're going to go 4x4. Now that's something you can get away with. The higher the resolution, you can drop it down to as low as 2x2, but this is going to have something to do also with the amount of available VRAM. Now, because we have 11 gigabytes of VRAM, we could get away with 6x6, but I don't believe the actual improvement to the look of the game is worth the performance hit. So you just saw me change right now super sampling and the shadow map. So those two settings hit apply. Look what happened to the FPS just in the menu alone. So let's go and get out of here, unpause. And it looks like that didn't really change too much here. Part of the terrain detail too is there's no mountains here, so I think one thing we'll do is we'll check that one setting in like Alaska before we end this video. But as you can see, we're still sitting at about 60 FPS.
I wonder if shadow maps only applies to objects and then terrain shadows is what the
What's funny is like the shadows, well, because it's also noon.
Yeah, you're right.
So why don't we change, well, let's keep going through the settings and we'll change the time of day and let them cast long shadows, because right now it's like noon, so in summertime, so it's nearly straight up. One other thing I want to change right here is let's come down here to, also, I'm not going to change anti-aliasing from TAA. Temporal anti-aliasing looks the best. When you drop that, even one setting down to DLAA or directionally localized anti-aliasing, it just looks so bad. Just leave it on TAA. Don't go FXAA. Just leave it. Trust me. You might see more FPS, but it will look so bad. You just are not going to be happy there. And as you can see right here in New York, at this time of day, it really didn't do anything for performance. If you look out the window, the trees still look all right. It didn't really take away any of the fluffiness to them. It seems like right around 60 FPS is where we're kind of locking it now. Here's what we're going to do. We are going to go ahead and we're going to end this flight. We're going to go to Alaska because that's going to be the best place to actually test the terrain detail slider to see what that does. And then we're going to go to Tokyo. And the reason why we're going to go to Tokyo is I have no idea why, but my system at home, when I loaded Tokyo, for the first 5 minutes of the flight, I was getting like 15 FPS. And yes, I was flying where I loaded into it. It didn't slew anywhere. So that just, I don't know. All right, so terrain detail would affect, obviously, like the tessellation of the mountains and such, essentially is what it's doing. Look at this. You would think that's a photo, huh? So one thing we're noticing is I'm getting way more of this pausing after we change the priority of the process. So I think what we'll do is we'll make it high right now instead of real time. So we are going to go ahead and make Flight Sim stop being the #1 priority on here. We're going to go back to set priority to high. that should hopefully stop the weirdness we were dealing with there. All right, so we're going to change something here that I'm curious as to what it's going to do to performance, because Phil and I have seen this help in the past in other titles and programs. You might have noticed that we were getting 60 to 65 FPS in New York with no noticeable visual fidelity loss whatsoever. It still looked crisp. Anti-aliasing was great. Shadows were great. The bloom and all that you saw really didn't hurt too much, so we left all that on. And remember, we are going through these settings and learning as we go with you. That's why it may seem like, oh, he talked about a thing that didn't really matter, because we're kind of showing you how those effects are. But obviously, we have a 3950X in here. So we installed Ryzen Master on here, and we are going to now turn on game mode, which is going to essentially turn off one of the CCXs. You saw how underutilized this CPU is. So what we don't want it doing is handing off tasks to the other CCX, which then communicates to the Affinity Fabric in terms of memory and all that, creating potential latency. That is why game mode exists in Ryzen. So I want to see if enabling game mode on here will give us any sort of improvement. Now, we also did make sure sure that XMP is enabled on the memory. This is a very memory intensive title as well, so we want to make sure our memory is running as fast as possible. All right, so with game mode enabled, I'll say our average FPS is much the same, but I feel like we are getting spikes up into the 70s. We weren't seeing 70s before at all. So here's our loop.